I'd like to welcome you all to the second of our lectures. This year we're going to be having 6 altogether. This time it will be a panel discussion on religion and Bishop Hill, not just in Bishop Hill, but on the attitudes of the religious groups surrounding Bishop Hill. We have with us this evening Professor Myron Fogarty of Augustana College, right here from the religious department, who is a specialist on the Pietist movement. To his right is Eric Miller from Scattergood Friends School. His specialty is the Adventist movement. To his right is Professor Rodney Davis of Knox College History Department, who will be talking about the relationship of Knox College to Bishop Hill and to the other religious groups in the area. To Myron's left is Lowell Bjorling of Altoona, who will talk about the attitudes of the Lutherans in the area surrounding Bishop Hill. And to his left is Reverend Philip Nordstrom, who will be talking about, am I right, Phil, about the colony religion?
No.
And the Methodists,
No,
about the Methodists, okay.
Yeah.
All right. And he is a Methodist lay minister. Okay.
No,
You're not?
I'm better than that.
You're better than that. I knew it. We've got a nice crowd here tonight. Next week we will be having Jim Oliver of Springfield, Illinois, who will be talking about John Root, and he says it's talking about John's roots. He's here this evening. Will Jim stand up? Jim, there he is. Very tall and easy to see. Okay, I'll turn it over to Myron, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Luanda. This evening our topic, as she announced, is the religious attitudes in Bishop Hill and those surrounding Bishop Hill towards the colony. The format that we'll be using is that each of us will be making a relatively brief presentation, and then there will be opportunity for dialogue among members of the panel and with members of the audience. So we hope that as the evening progresses that you will have an opportunity to raise any questions should you desire to raise them. It was my assignment to make the first rather brief presentation simply because in chronological order it does come first, and I think it rather sets a context for the presentations to be made by the other members of the panel. My concern is to address the issue of what is the nature of the human being as perceived by some of the religious leaders in Western Illinois in time before this part of the country became American mainline. And coming from Rock Island, we tend to think that Western Illinois became American mainline when the first railroad bridge was constructed across the Mississippi River in 1856, tying the West to the East and creating the iron bonds of union. In the years preceding that, there were some very interesting religious figures in Western Illinois, and they had rather different ideas as to what is the human being. The first one that I would like to briefly refer to was the prophet at Nauvoo, Joseph Smith of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Smith's theology about human nature is extremely positive. An address that he made in Nauvoo in 1844, just a couple of months before his assassination, was the occasion of a memorial discourse for a leader in the church. And addressing a general conference of the church and looking out over some 10,000 members of the church, he extolled the virtues of the human being, and historians tend to record it in a very simple phrase, though looking through the extensive address, that phrase is never there. But the phrase is an accurate summation of what he took many, many words to say. And that is simply this: as man is, God was. As God is, man may become. As it is stated in one of the catechisms of the Mormon Church, we are all gods in embryo. So that what we are is a potential God. And if we exercise discipline, because knowledge is the way of salvation, if we exercise discipline with regard to the maturation of our knowledge, we will not only bring our individual lives into full fruition, but we will establish an organized life about us in terms of our family, in terms of our community, eventually in terms of the environment. We will become a God. Now that was the expression that was fielded at Nauvoo up until the church left Nauvoo months after Joe Smith was assassinated in 1844. But there were others who came to this area also with a very optimistic understanding of human nature. One of those was Jonas Hedstrom, who led in the formation of Victoria in 1837. He was a Methodist, I think we can say more safely here, lay preacher to begin with and not get in trouble. And Jonas Hedstrom, where he got his theology is somewhat debatable. It had some tie with John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, but was devoid of the academic organization that Mr. Wesley had, and was an idea that was extremely positive about what a human being could be. And my suggestion is, in looking at Jonas Hedstrom, though he never suggested that a person could become God, he at least did imbibe with the Wesleyan idea that the human being can be so filled with the Spirit of God that, though still human, it is unaware that there's anything but godly motifs within a human life. And that much, I think, at least he brings forth from the tradition of John Wesley, and so offered to the people here in the second Garden of Eden of Western Illinois up until his retirement in 1857, the idea that you can develop really into perfection. At least perfection to the point that you don't realize you're imperfect and act as if you were completely under the dominance of the Spirit of God. And then coming into the scene next in the chronological order of their arrival in the area, of course, is Erik Janssen here at Bishop Hill. He too was influenced apparently somewhat by the Methodistic background of a George Scott in Sweden, and also by the devotional movement that was taking place at that time in those provinces in northern Sweden. But what you have in Erik Janssen, by his own admission in his autobiography and in the comments of those living in the colony reflecting upon his religious idea, was not a relative perfection, but was more like Smith's absolute perfection. He did not believe it was possible for one who lived by scriptural admonition to sin, and that any reference to forgiveness, such as in the Lord's Prayer, was directed toward other people, not toward himself. So he was convinced of what an individual could become, and therefore represents this strain of the Wesleyan as seen in Hedstrom and of Joseph Smith as seen in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The enormous human potential. And then there arrived in Andover at the end of that decade of the 40s, Lars Björn Edsbjorn, who came here with the rather strong convictions that Methodist is all right. But when he got to this country and got involved in the wrangling that was going on here between, say, Jonas Hedstrom and Erik Janssen, about which an early settler in the colony writes that they had their go-to over here in the colony church was supposed to last for 3 days, and after 1 year they had one day they had said such uncouth things about one another that they gave up the discussion. Esbjorn came to the conclusion that he did not find human perfectibility here in Western Illinois. So instead he went back and began to review the confessional statements of the Lutheran Church, going all the way back to the Formula of Concord in 1577 and the Augsburg Confession in 1530, and came to the conviction, as Luther himself had come in the 16th century, that we are one and the same time a saint and a sinner, always in need of forgiveness, and that we should constantly be concerned about that. So what you have here in Western Illinois in those early decades of settlement are those caught up in the westward advance which perceived this to be the Garden of Eden where the human race could be what it was supposed to be, and those like Lars Paul Esbjorn who said, no, even coming out to this Garden of Eden has not changed human nature as it has developed over the centuries, and it is saint and sinner all at the same time and forever both. Now, I hope that provides a bit of a frame for what we're going to be talking about as we listen to the other speakers this evening. And we'll turn now to Philip Nordstrom, who is going to comment on the presence of the Methodists in Bishop Hill with the organization of the congregation within a half-decade of the dissolving of the colony. Yep.
All right. Now, since it's already been announced that I'm a Methodist minister, I want to tell you that right away that I don't intend to preach my 10-point sermon, or my 3-point sermon, or any other kind of point sermon. Get that out of the way. Personally, I am 100% Swedish and 100% Methodist by family heritage. So a lot of what I say will probably be prejudiced. Might as well warn you that in the first place. Olaf Hedstrom, the brother of Jonas Hedstrom, who's already been referred to, was a Methodist who came to this area and settled in Victoria. His brother Olaf had been a preacher in New York City, preaching mostly to Swedish sailors as they were docked and were in New York. And Jonas Hedstrom, however, wanted to come to Western Illinois because he'd heard about it and settled in Victoria, where they started the church. And there is the place where Olaf Olsen, who was sent by Erik Jansson to find a place for the new colony here, first stopped in Illinois and spent some time there with Jonas Hedstrom. And while there, he, according to much judgment, he became a Methodist under the preaching of Jonas Hedstrom. But when Erik Jansson arrived, they had quite a debate there. In fact, it almost became violent, according to some things that I've read, and that resulted in the debate why Olaf Olsen turned back to Janssonism again. So he continued as a Jansonist and came and settled here in Bishop Hill and was one of the prominent leaders in Bishop Hill colony. So there was conflict right away between the Jansonists and the Methodists, and that conflict continued seemingly on into Bishop Hill. There was a debate in the first tent church here between Jansson and Hedstrom, Jonas Hedstrom from Victoria, and he had been invited to visit. And so that debate too got quite heated, and we don't know exactly what came of it. But according to what you've already heard, the Jansonists believed in a kind of absolute Christian perfection, and John Wesley had taught the possibility of perfection, although John Wesley said that he only knew two people who measured up in his estimation to having attained perfection, and he himself never claimed to have attained perfection. But John Wesley was pretty doctrinaire, and the later Methodists, especially those who came to this country, weren't so doctrinaire, and they probably agreed more with what John Wesley said when he was meeting a Christian brother of another faith. He said, if your heart is right as my heart is right, give me your hand. And that's about the way Methodists in this country have conducted themselves, and have not insisted that you have to believe like I believe, you have to live like I live if you're going to be a Methodist. because there had been great freedom, seemingly in the Methodist Church, and probably was even back there in the early years. I'm not sure about that because I wasn't living then. But anyhow, I know that in my experience since that time, having grown up in Bishopville Swedish Methodist Church first, and then Bishopville United Methodist Church later, why there was no great emphasis upon doctrinal beliefs. Now, Bishopville, as a Methodist place, it grew out of the dissolution of the Jansenists after he was killed, and the colony began to fall apart under the administration of the trustees. When the colony was dissolved, there was considerable confusion. Now, some of that confusion had begun while Jansen was still alive. And there were those who got fed up with the living in a commune, and they left, and some of them went to Victoria, where they no doubt became Methodists. And so, after the dissolution of the Bishopville colony, that seeming disintegration continued at a greater scale. And so it was an opportunity for the Methodist Church to send preachers into this area, and so that's the way the Bishopville Swedish Methodist Church began. And there was a Swedish, in 1860 there was Swedish mission work under the Central Illinois Conference, and Jonas Hedstrom visited A.J. Anderson, invited A.J. Anderson to preach here in Bishopville in the Colony Church. Now, Jonas Hedstrom, of course, was one of who had been former Jansenists, but he invited this Methodist preacher to come preach in the Colony Church. And that happened on several occasions until A.J. Anderson wore out his welcome. I imagine some of the things he preached didn't go down very well with the former Jansenists in Bishopville. And so there was preaching going on in one of the schoolhouses west of Bishopville. I don't know its exact location because I don't know the names of the farmers who lived around that school at the time. But then there was preaching also here in this school. And then in 1863, Bishop Hill was first mentioned as an appointment to be supplied in the let's see if I get the name of that right. Named to be supplied in the conference, which was held in Rock Island. And at that time, of course, there was no organized Methodist church here. But that was the beginning of it. And so it wasn't long, it's just the next year that the church here in Bishopville was organized. And there are two historical references to its organization in 1864. And so that we know that the church as an organization began in 1864 after the colony had been dissolved. So the transition and the change was rather rapid, and I would like to share with you a portion of the account of what happened in the early years of the church here in Bishopville, as it is recorded in the history of the Bishopville Community United Methodist Church. Reverend A.J. Anderson was the first Methodist preacher to reside in Bishopville, and he preached in Galvin, Kewanee also. But great strides were marked in the pastorate of A.J. Anderson, who remained here for 4 years. On January 17, 1867, 46 members were taken into the church, the largest number taken in at any one time. 2 weeks later, 11 more were added, and the following week, 8 others, which made a total of 65 persons within 3 weeks. In the early part of 1868, 67 persons were taken into church membership during a period of about 5 weeks. In January the following year, 39 persons were received, and on Christmas Day the same year, 15 more. During the first 2 months in 1870, the accessions numbered 42. During the 4 years of Anderson's pastorate at Bishopville, a total of 302 persons were taken into the church as preparatory members, as was the custom. Most of them became active members. So that you see how rapidly the church grew under the pastorate of Reverend A.J. Anderson in its early years. And though the church was organized in 1864, the first church building, they at first had met in a corner room of the colony church. Then, when the church was organized, they were meeting in the upper floor of the blacksmith building, the north room up there in that building, and that's where the church was organized. And then they, in 1869, the building, which now is the United Methodist Church, was built. Of course, it's been remodeled a couple of times since. But I like to think that that has continued down through the years to the present time as a going institution, the longest lasting institution in Bishopville, Illinois.
Thank you, Philip. Now, to another religious organization that made its formal appearance in the area in 1867, still within a decade of the dissolution of the colony, and that is the Adventist Church, and Eric Miller will tell us about that.
I can relate a lot of details to folks later if they want to hear them, but my approach was going to be to talk a little bit about the project that I did back in 1986, which was my honors thesis at Knox College. And the focus of that was less oriented toward just relating facts than it was explaining certain things about the Adventists. So, but I can give you facts on the Adventists if you want them. But I wanted to go back to this theme that Myron began with, this theme of perfection that existed in Bishop Hill among the Jansenists. And the question that I wanted to get at in my research was, first of all, what religion attracted the core of the Jansenists, the people who were most committed to Jansen and to Jansenism, and of course perfectionism would be implied in that. Now, the way that I went about finding that was that I looked at the legal parties at the dissolution of the colony, and I surmised that the people who were members of the Olson Party, who were reluctant to give up the communal structure of the society, were those people who were most committed to Jansenism. And I found that most of those people became Adventists. So the question I asked myself was why? And what I wanted to get at there was, what about Adventism attracted these people that had been so committed to Eric Jansen's teachings and the idea of perfectionism? Part of what attracted those folks was probably just an aversion to Methodism, because as Myron related to you, there was a lot of conflict between Jonas Hedstrom and Eric Jansen, and a lot of the people in the community probably resisted becoming Methodists simply because of the anger they harbored against Hedstrom. But I felt that there were probably some other reasons, some deeper reasons. And I felt that those reasons had to do with certain continuities between Jansenism and Adventism. And what I did to get a handle on this was to put the different religions into a sociological framework and to understand them from the perspective of sociology, which is my background. The perfectionism of Eric Jansen is the central aspect of his belief system. And I think it's rightly the one that most researchers emphasize. And what I wanted to find out was, how did this perfectionism play itself out in terms of the community? And what I felt was, if I were a communalist and I believed that I was perfect and that the people in my community were perfect, what kind of orientation would I have to the outside world? Okay? Because I would hold that the outside world, of course, was still fallen, even though myself and my companions were all perfect in God. Well, I read a book by a man named Brian Wilson that sort of gave me a framework for understanding this. And he characterizes different religious groups in different ways. And communal groups he refers to as introversionist groups. Introversionist, that is, they look inward, within themselves, rather than outward at the larger society. And I felt that the Jansenist ideas of perfectionism were compatible with this kind of communal orientation that the group had. The Adventists, unlike the Methodists, were much less compromising with the outside world. The Adventists held that the outside world was fallen, and the Methodists agreed to an extent. But the Methodists believed in compromise with the outside world. Philip Nordstrom's talk about allowing freedom within Methodism, I think, is an indication of that. And not only did Methodists allow a fair amount of freedom between themselves about what was right and wrong, they also granted a fair amount of understanding of other groups and the outside society in general. The Adventists, on the other hand, were less compromising with the outside world and were much stricter in their morality. So I felt that a lot of the people that became Adventists, who had been very strong Jansenists, did so because this attitude toward the outside world was compatible with the attitude that they had as Jansenists. So that's the basic outline of my research. Now, in terms of the numbers, initially the Adventists were very successful, but they were successful primarily among this older group of people. And later, the younger people went to the Methodist Church, and eventually the Adventist Church died out. And I think that the Methodists were successful because they were more forward-looking and more compromising with the outside world and with American ways. And I think that the Adventists probably clung more to the old ways, and that the younger people did not feel that the Adventist faith was relevant to them. So by the 19-teens, the Adventist Church had pretty much died out, but of course the Methodist Church still survives. So that's the basic outline, and if anyone has any questions about that, I'll be glad to answer them at the end.
Okay, thank you, Eric. We have now looked briefly at movement within Bishop Hill following the dissolution of the colony. Let us turn now to look back upon the Eric Jansen days as those outside of the colony evaluated what was going on here in Bishop Hill. And to start us with that, we have Professor Davis from Knox College talking about the American Home Missionary Society, Jonathan Blanchard, and Lars Paul Jesborg.
Obviously, this is going to deal with outside non-Swedish perceptions of Bishop Hill Colony. And I think it's also important to emphasize that these outside perceptions were indeed translated to action. The American Home Mission Society was basically a New England organization, a joint effort of Presbyterians and Congregationalists. It dates from early in the 19th century, and its focus was basically from New England on to the West. The founding members of this society were Calvinists, and as Calvinists, they were not possessed of an optimistic understanding of human nature. And I think we would also want to say that they were not perfectionists. The great concern of the American Home Missionary Society was essentially to reclaim Presbyterians and Congregationalists who had got away from their congregations and their denominations by moving west. To send missionaries out, not really to make additional Presbyterians and Congregationalists, but simply to round up those who had escaped. And to a considerable degree, to try to preclude the Trans-Appalachian country becoming a kind of moral vacuum, because it was acknowledged that Presbyterians and Congregationalists, like all others, were susceptible to the blandishments of other agencies that might be operative in the West. Probably the principal, although mostly unstated, foe of the American Home Missionary Society in the 1830s was an influence that was generally referred to as the enemies of civil liberties. But everybody knew that to talk about the enemies of civil liberties was to talk about the Roman Catholic Church. Barely to be tolerated in the West by members of the Home Missionary Society were those sects who were able to establish themselves indigenously, like the Methodists and the Baptists. They were emphatically poor relations. Now, as if all this weren't bad enough, the Home Missionary Society's agents found themselves confronted in the 1840s in western Illinois with the appalling presence of Mormons. They were not especially appalled by Mormon antinomianism, or the Mormons were not particularly antinomian, but they certainly were possessed of perfectionist views of a sort, which seemed outright Christian heresies. And almost immediately on the heels of the Mormons, once they had got out of the territory, Jansenists from Sweden moved in, admittedly in smaller numbers and for that reason less threatening, but nonetheless quite noticeable. Now, we shouldn't be surprised that Knox College should be an especial center of anti-Jansenist concern in western Illinois in the late 1840s. Knox's president, Jonathan Blanchard, Knox's new president, Jonathan Blanchard, had only been on the scene since late 1845, was an ardent temperance advocate. He was a Congregationalist minister. He was a radical on the slavery question. He was death on secret societies, and he was a correspondent of the American Home Missionary Society. And he was also quite well acquainted with those ministers in the area who were being supported by the Missionary Society. Blanchard then was absolutely willing to believe the worst about Bishop Hill and Eric Jansen. I have brought along with me copies of a couple of letters written by Eric Jansen in conjunction with his activities relative to Bishop Hill, and I think I'm just going to let them speak for themselves. I'm going to read them if you will bear with me. One of these is a letter written to Reverend Milton Badger, back in Boston, of the Home Mission Society on January 31st, 1848. The Jansenists had hardly been in this area 2 years, less than 2 years, but already their reputation was spreading far and wide. The Swedes of Henry County, 20 miles from this place, are multiplying by immigration and permeating this whole community. And the prophet Johnson, which is how Blanchard spelled Eric Jansen's name, the prophet Johnson, who is the leader, is likely to rival the fortunes, if not eclipse the fame of Joe Smith. A ministering brother near them, who was just now at my house, informed me that there is circumstantial evidence of several murders by poison of men of property who went there to visit their wives, who were led away by the prophet and left their families to save their souls from hell. Certain it is that the men forthwith sickened and died. Those who read Swedish inform me that Johnson's catechism teaches that the light which the Almighty produces by His Word was but natural light, and therefore inferior to the spiritual light introduced to the world by Himself, by Jansen that is. They inform me, moreover, that upon the command, "Thou shalt not bear false witness," he makes an exception that they may lie when the good of religion or the glory of God demands it. that Judas told only the truth when he told what Christ was. And if they tell the truth to the injury of religion, they are Judases. Certain it is that his prophets lie with the most quiet assurance of any set of men I ever saw. 2 of them lately at my house denied advising some half-dozen poor honest people who are at labor in this town to return to Johnson's settlement on pain of damnation, when the Swedes, without concert, agreed so perfectly and were so clear in their statements, without any possible motive to falsify, that there can be no rational doubt of their truth. A Swede who is a Methodist preacher, blacksmith, undoubtedly Jonas Hedstrom, has got several families away from Johnson who are beginning to do well outside his community. But he, that is Johnson, draws in 100 to 1 probably, as he has agents and runners plying every Swedish and Norwegian settlement in this state, Iowa, and Wisconsin. If a sort of Lutheran minister could be found who would devote himself to building up a community of Protestant Swedes away from Johnson so that refugees from the prophet could find regular religious exercises elsewhere, I think something may be done toward opening the eyes of those poor deluded peasants who are suffering every extreme under the sorcery of this bad man. One of the greatest difficulties they make about leaving is, and here Blanchard is quoting Swedish refugees in the aggregate, "If we go away and Johnson send us to hell, can we find a priest who will give us religion?" I send you these notices simply to remind you of facts interesting to the cause of Christ in the West. As Johnson has interdicted having children and his people are bound by covenant to labor for nothing, and be content with such fare as he gives them, as he has broken up or rather broken down all family rule by his house for girls and house for men at lodging houses, while they work under his keepers and sub-creatures, by concentrated industry he will soon have a harbor or nesting place for all foul things to congregate, unless something is done to open the eyes of his dupes, many of whom have left him, and break the spell by which he holds them, to wit, the impression that his community is the nucleus of the regenerated world. Before the end of the next year, Lars Paul Esbjørn appeared in Galesburg. He turned out to be just that sort of Lutheran minister that Blanchard was looking for. Esbjørn was asking for financial assistance in ministering to Swedish immigrants in Western Illinois. He was asking for financial assistance from the American Home Missionary Society, and a committee that was headed by Blanchard approved his application with the following stipulations. 1, that he be amenable to association as a member. 2, he is to preach and administer the ordinances, rites, and discipline of the church as an evangelical Lutheran minister of Christ. He is to labor in Andover and Galesburg. There are already in Andover 180 Swedes, and in Galesburg 100. There are also Swedes settled at Knoxville and Henderson, 5 miles distant from this place in contrary directions. They have no shepherd of the line. A Methodist brother has been attempting something for them, and a few have been spiritually benefited. But in all this region, and the Swedes are settling throughout this region, there is, to our knowledge, not one church or even Methodist class exclusively for the benefit of the Swedes. Prophet Johnson's community accepted, which combines the worst features of papacy and Mormonism. These stipulations to which Esbjørn were held appear pretty broad. But we also know that an important but here unstated stipulation was that membership, even in Esbjørn's Swedish church, if he were to receive American Home Missionary Society assistance, should be allowed only to the converted, only to those who had had a conversion experience. And obviously this is a notion that was foreign to the Church of Sweden. In fact, it's generally foreign to any liturgical denomination. However, Esbjorn would allow that in 1849. That could be taken a measure of his financial desperation, I suppose, but it could also be taken as a measure of the extent to which he had fallen away from the Church of Sweden in Sweden. Ironically, though, by the mid-1850s, after further experience with American religious pluralism, sectarianism, if you will, Esbjorn's Lutheranism, which was weak in Sweden as he inclined toward pietism, was in Illinois stronger than it ever had been. And ultimately he was uncomfortable with the American Home Missionary Society and its stipulations. He had been obliged to spend time with the likes of Jonas Hedstrom and with certain Jansenists. The irony, I guess, in the career of Lars Esbjorn is that he had to leave Sweden and come to Illinois in order to become a Lutheran.
And Lutheran he became. And the Lutheran attitude toward Bishop Hill, well, we will hear two descriptions now, one more negative than the other, neither one of them indicating any positive assessment. And this is for Lowell to tell us.
I was interested in his remarks about Esbjorn from reading the indications that I was getting from the work that I was looking into and reading to develop the ideas and the attitudes of Lutheranism to Jansen. And I think I was a little confused at first, and I'm certainly not confused after I'd done a lot of research, but especially from my own family's point of view. If you and I were placed in the historical settings we are looking at today, I wonder who we would believe and just who we would consider having the true light of religion. In researching on how the local Lutherans of yesteryear viewed Bishop Hill, I was reminded of Pilate's question to Jesus during his trial when Pilate asked Jesus, "What is truth?" It is easy for us from this point of view to see the developments from a historical perspective and know that possibly each group that had a part of the truth. Were you and I living the life of a common worker of their day in Sweden, a life of restricted opportunity, difficult class distinctions, and a state church indifferent to the people's moral and temporal life needs, and with little hope for the future to be any better, we would easily leave the teachings of our fathers for something that promised some improvement in our lot. Newly arrived Lars Esbjorn and Tuvi Hasselquist worked to keep people from Jansenism and also Methodism. Those two men were proponents of the Great Revival, the movements in Sweden. So from the start, they imparted a strongly evangelical low church character in contrast to the state church in Sweden at that time. I think this is very important. Dr. Davis had referred to the religion and the practice of the Lutheran Church that Hasselquist and Esbjorn brought with them was low church. It was not the high church that the people who had come here, and also the people who had broken away from the Lutheran Church in Sweden to go to the Läsare or the Jansenists had found. The Jansenists, as people from Bishop Hill became known, were courted by both Esbjorn and Hasselquist as they left the Bishop Hill colony, but very few were ever converted back to the Lutheranism. Many who abandoned the colony settled around Victoria and Galesburg. Hasselquist worked with these people to bring them back to the fold of the true Lutheran faith. In one reference, he taught and argued, cajoled a former Jansenist for several hours north of Victoria, but to no avail. Methodism was a much more appealing alternative religion to Jansenists than going back to the Lutheran faith from which they had fled. The Lutheran Church in America was not the high church they had known in Sweden, but they had been so turned off by their earlier experiences, many would not listen at all, even though Pastor Hasselquist was a very convincing and appealing person. There was a very sincere concern by Lutheran leaders of that day for their fellow countrymen. In one reference recorded in a brief history of northeastern Iowa by S.M. Hill, one congregation recorded a deep concern about the Bishop Hill colony being led by that sadly notorious Eric Jansen. In papers written by Helen Dale Beerling for a study of the Lutheran Church in Altoona, incidentally for one of Dr. Fogarty's classes, we find in the church board notes a motion to send missionaries to Bishop Hill to save their souls. Another notation also refers to people who had left the Bishop Hill colony having no use for Lutheranism. These church records were kept in the Swedish language, and they were translated for Helen Dale by Thisbe Alien Hawks. Many Altoona church records also referred to dismissals. In Swedish you call them Ausschlussen, but I don't believe there were any dismissals or Outlusens for consorting with Jansenists, but there were for consorting with Methodists and loose living. After being in America for a few years, colonists were apparently not considered a threat. I mean, the Jansenist colonists were not considered a threat to gain more converts to Bishop Hill. Rather, there was no indications that I have been able to find of being Ausschlussen for consorting with the Jansenists. This is borne out by the people in my own family. There were two very distinctly different attitudes towards Bishop Hill in my family. My grandfather Gus came from Ovanåker, a parish in Hälsingland, midway between Edsbyn and Älvsta. Many of the colonists and later arrivals in Bishop Hill were friends and neighbors of his family in Sweden. While he retained a strong loyalty to the Lutheran faith himself, he was quite concerned about some of the degrading practices going on in some of the Lutheran churches in Sweden of his day. He had told the family of Brunvin being made in the basements of the parsonage and some of the other disgraceful conduct of the church hierarchy. Because of the old connections with the families from Sweden and to his concern about the moral state of the Lutheran Church in Sweden, he represented a view that some Lutherans held in this area. They looked at the colonists with a kind of understanding respect. However, they were concerned about the eventual outcome of this kind of faith and what it may happen to these friends, their friends, as well as the children of these friends. This is probably one reason he felt compelled to hold a Sunday school in Swamp College schoolhouse up northwest of town here on Sunday afternoons. Of course, this was quite a while after the dissolution of the colony, but it did reflect a concern for the offspring of those families. I've often wondered whether he used Lutheran material or what the situation, what kind of material he used, but I have no idea. My mother's family, the Carlson family, were also very loyal Lutherans. However, the Carlson family immigrated from Kalmarland, Småland. They were Smålanding, and to my knowledge, they had no contact with the people that followed Jansen while they were in Sweden. They may have heard of him, but I'm sure that that was the extent of their contact with them. I was 2 when my grandfather Carlson died, but my mother was very fond of quoting a lot of his sayings and would quote him very distinctly and exactly. And when he spoke of Bishop Hill, it was not with an affection or much concern about their outcome. She used to quote him as saying, when he would speak, "Det var gamla kolonia." And it was, I know from the tone of her voice, the way she said "gamla kolonia," it was it was not with a great deal of favor. My father's family always spoke affectionately of Bishop Hill, but my mother's unguarded remarks reflected her family's attitude. It was one of rather disapproval. The other side of the other part of the Beerling family, 2 of my father's brothers became Methodists. So they were obviously were not. They had seen some of the. They were disenchanted with the Lutheran Church in Sweden, and were perhaps did not think that there was enough change in the Lutheran Church that they saw here that they were satisfied with. So they became good Methodists. So I think that reflects probably the attitude that the Beerling family probably took in looking at the Lutheran Church with some not distaste or anything like that, but that it did need an improvement. I think the main point that in spite of all the workings of the Lutherans in trying to gather in the people after they left Bishop Hill, the disillusioned colonists that was referred to going to Galesburg and Victoria. They worked very difficult. They worked very hard, but in many references you read to them, they were totally unable to reach them and to bring them back to the Lutheran fold. But by the same token, I think it was to a great deal because of their memory of Sweden, and to a large extent the class distinctions, because the class distinctions that the people felt of the immigrants who come here. It was amazing. In doing some of this research, I was surprised, and I guess I should have known it. But there were 4 distinct ways you could address a lady in Sweden in the 1800s, and each one of them distinguished the class she was from. And another interesting story, and it would be interesting to you people who grew up on a farm. In one of the letters that I was reading from a gentleman who was working on a farm south of Knoxville in Knox County, he relates all the good things about his lot there, and that also that there was a Lutheran church in Galesburg and that he could attend that. But one of the things that was amazing, was interesting, and it indicated very distinctly how important being in a no-class type of setting and communities that he enjoyed. He related that the man had 5 horses and 40 pigs, and he had 13 or 14 cows, cattle, and the man himself milked the cows. A distinction that, if you think about it, the Bundesmann in Sweden never did his own milking either. I mean, that was, to this man, it was the height of seeing the destruction of class distinction. And I think, to a large extent, that was one of the things that also the Lutherans claimed to these people after they had left. I interviewed several of the older members that I thought perhaps would remember remarks or off-front remarks about the attitude of their families to the Bishop Hill colony while it was after the dissolution. Many of these family ideas and thoughts and beliefs are passed on. And a lady in Altoona who's is now 94 said that her mother always said that those Bishop Hill colony people were too proud of their religion, usually with very little variation. That was one of as I visited with people and looked at their writings from the family, that was the one thing that also was very distinctly prominent, and that was that the people of the colony were extremely proud of the religion they held. I think the Lutherans in this area, to sum it up, I think a lot of the Lutherans in the area wanted to claim their Swedish relations with Bishop Hill, but not their religion.
Well, thank you, members of the panel. You have been true to the clock, which then allows ample opportunity for members of the panel as well as members of the audience to raise any inquiries of any one of us that you would seek to do so as we continue to try and unravel whether or not you can be perfect. Yes, Lily.
Yes, I have done a good deal of research on both Bishop Hill and Andover and the conditions in Sweden. And I have been making notes more on what was not said here tonight than what has been said. That's not to say that it was not interesting to listen to you, but I thought for the benefit of everybody who's here, maybe we should mention that there was a Lutheran congregation founded here in Bishop Hill in 1866. The record book is at the Swedish Lutheran Church in Altoona, and I was wondering if you ever seen it.
Never seen it.
I have seen it, and it has been microfilmed. And there are quite a few members. I could not detect any former Jansenists. Most of the members were people that had moved from Sweden to Bishop Hill, which was called Berlin at that time. Yes. But I thought it was interesting anyways that a Lutheran congregation was founded in Bishop Hill. Then you did not mention that the Covenant Church was founded here in 1877. And that was also thanks to Jonas Hedstrom. And in that connection, I would like to mention that I think that the former colonists, they listened a great deal to Jonas Hedstrom. And as Jonas Hedstrom went, so went the colonists. We heard here tonight that he contacted a first Methodist preacher to come here. Then he soon found out his preaching was not to his liking, so he went away from the Methodists. Then he met with some Second Adventists, and he listened to them, and then he was very easily swayed, evidently. And since nobody in Bishop Hill at that time knew anything about the Adventists, it was very easy for Jonas Hedstrom to get a large following to come and be baptized. And they were baptized here in the Old Colony Church. But the records do not say that it was an Adventist congregation. It just says that the congregation was called the Church on the Hill. And the records are in Swedish. But there are only 2 minutes of meetings. And nowhere does it say that it was an Adventist congregation. But of course we do have the book by Eric Janssen's son, Captain Eric Johnson. And because he was here then, and he probably is the one that knew what was going on. And he says it was a second-day Adventist congregation. And I was listening to Eric Miller, and he didn't mention either what kind of Adventist we had here in Bishop Hill. And I think maybe one of the reasons that it did not last was that it was a second day rather than a seventh-day Adventist congregation. I think most of you know that the second day, or second Adventist, it's so easy to say second day, but it's second Adventist. They believed in the coming of Christ on a certain day, and they got ready even here at Bishop Hill on a certain day. And when it did not happen, then people lost faith. And I happen to believe that after that, Jonas Hedstrom, he preached his own form of religion in the Old Colony Church, because there are no records whatsoever in any Adventist archives about an Adventist congregation here. It was John Hedstrom who became an Adventist, actually, and he sort of kept it up on Jonas Hedstrom. He went away from it. Then I would like to mention too that Matilda, the daughter of Eric Jansson, became a Lutheran. I don't think too many people know about that either. If he couldn't hold his own daughter to the Jansenist faith, that's pretty bad. Because she married a Lutheran in Andover, and you find her name in the Lutheran church records in Andover, Matilda, the daughter of Eric Jansson. Then I think that it's a shame to have Dr. Fugde here, a specialist on pietism, and not to speak about the pietism in Sweden. I would be very happy if he could say something about, for instance, the pietism that led to the conventicle edict in 1726. The edict that was in effect when the Jansenists fled Sweden. Eric Miller mentioned the strict morals of the Jansenists. I wouldn't agree with that, because everybody knows that Eric Jansson himself not have strict morals. And his followers, they forgave him. They didn't hold him to it.
It's always a difference in what you preach and what you do.
Yes. And as far as the class distinction, I think that it was necessary for the landowners here in Illinois to milk their own cows. There weren't enough women to do it. I don't think it's because they felt that they were not too good for it. I'm sure they did, but they had to, by necessity, sit down and milk their own cows. And even Asbjörn did, milk his own cow. So it wasn't so much that there were no class distinctions here. It was the necessity on the frontier.
Nevertheless, even if it was a necessity, when you write that stuff back to Sweden, which that was the letter going back, it would have a great deal of effect.
Yes, right, but not the way you think. They thought, oh, that's terrible. They didn't think that was noble or anything. They would think that's terrible. We have servants here in Sweden that do that kind of thing. That's the way they would think.
I would too, if I were a large owner, a large person with a large farm there. But I wouldn't think so if I was a bedraggled drängen.
No, that's true.
And that's who they were appealing to.
Yeah, that's true. You're right. Yeah. Okay.
There was a group, covenant group here for a time at that period too, but I don't know much about it.
It didn't last
very short life.
But again, Jonas Hedstrom, he was the one that brought in August Skogsford, who became the father of the Swedish Covenant Church in America. And at that time, he believed in the Swedish mission's covenant preaching. So as Jonas Hedstrom went, so went Bishop Hill. Probably, except for the Lutheran Church.
Was there a comment back there?
I had one question about Eric North on the supposition that the people believe in communalism and are in the Olson party. One thing, like Willie mentioned, the dynamic personality of Jonas Olson was important. And also in the Olson party, there was a large percentage of widows and spinsters and not so many families. And the Johnson party was mostly the families. And so they would kind of economically favor communalism as an economic necessity for themselves because they could survive better under that kind of situation than if they were split off by themselves. And there was a large number of those women in Bishop Hill at that time. So you got to temper your ideas just a little on those lines.
Yeah, well, thank you. Most of the conclusions, I don't even want to call them that I came to were very preliminary, and I don't want to exaggerate the claims here for those things, and I appreciate that because that really helps round out the thing somewhat. I mean, to know those details, gives us, I think, a better perspective on what was going on. I didn't mention before, I don't think, that the Olson party wanted to postpone going to the individualized economy as soon as the other party or parties did, and there's some ambiguity about how many parties there were. And I've heard the figure 1 year, I believe it was in Mickelson, that I heard that the Olson faction wanted to wait 1 year after the others. There's also a figure of 2 or 3 years that comes from Bigelow, I believe. And if anyone knows the answer to that, I'd like to know that as well, because I think that bears to some extent on this question. But yeah, there may definitely have been economic motives involved with people wanting to retain communalism. I don't think that necessarily means that Adventism, the supposition that Adventism served some function for these people who wanted to retain communalism, I don't think is undermined by that information, but I do think it's important to have that.
Comment, Ron?
Yeah, Eric, a couple things that I think would be very valuable for you to bring out here is that the assumption that we're getting is that everybody raced out of the Bishop Hill colony and joined another Christian organization. And I think you and I did some statistics on that. And the other thing was that the unusual fact that when you were doing your research and what we uncovered was that the Adventists met in the colony church but sent their children to the Methodists.
Yeah. We did an interview on that and found out that that was the case. And there were a lot of other things that I didn't mention. There was a lot of other research that I did, but I thought that, I thought that my goal should be to talk about the Adventists and to talk about the paper that I did. But there were many other things I could talk about, like the mission covenant, or it's known by various names. I think it's the Evangelical Covenant Church now. Ron kind of helped me out with this a little bit, and we looked into that somewhat, and I could not find any membership records at all for that congregation. There are a couple of recorded references to it in various places. Probably the most interesting one is in the Methodist records, where it says that a few people left to join the Covenant Church. There was also a Covenant Church building here in town, but apparently it was moved to Galva. It must not have been here more than 30 years before it was moved. So it probably wasn't very long lived here in Bishop Hill. It's also questionable how many people were interested in religion at all after the breakup of the commune. A lot of people say that the colonists were sort of burned out, as it were, on religion. And there are quite a few people that did not have any clear affiliation with any church. In fact, I estimated that it was possible that there may have been as many as 100 who don't, appear in any of the church's records, and we don't know what happened with those folks, if they just became disillusioned, or if they could have moved, or any number of things could have happened. There's no way to know for sure, but there is that question. Also, I'd like to respond, if I could, to the question that was brought up about moralism with Eric Jansen. I think that's an accurate observation that you made, because I think I was mistaken in saying that the Jansenists were highly moralistic. I think what I meant to say there was that there was a sort of an uncompromising attitude toward the outside world. Now, that may or may not have been moralistic, but I think that the Adventists shared that perspective with the Jansenists, where the Methodists, I don't think, had quite that extreme a view of the outside world.
What I hear being said is that once Eric Jansen's community had dissolved, there was a certain vacuity of religion here, and being in the American Midwest, everyone came in to compete. Some lasted a while, some lasted very briefly. In an overarching survey such as this tonight, there probably are groups I'll never be referred to. There were some who did last for a while. But I hear being said also that perhaps all of these competing groups collectively did not make that much impression on the colonists, but perhaps made more of an impression on later settlers who came to settle in the area. Yes, John?
I think the theme of the fluidity of the frontier is one that comes through this too. Esbjorn himself was delayed in getting to Andover in 1849 because of his own illness, and he discovered to his horror when he got here that the Hedstrom Methodists had been there before him and were working among his flock, sowing the seeds of Methodism in what he felt to be his pietistic Lutheran community. And there were also mentions by Hasselquist in the mid-1850s from Galesburg about the fact that most of the Galesburg Swedes were unrepentant Jansenists. That didn't deter him from working among them, though, and getting a church started. And I think it would be interesting to compare the statistics in that early Lutheran church in Galesburg with a Jansenist versus non-Jansenist participation.
That was the thing he found in the research that I read, John, is that the Jansenists were very, very difficult to convert. He would argue when they did visit with each other and they would talk, but very few conversions, if any.
Quite a few of the original members of the Swedish Methodist Church here had been in the colony and had been prominent in the colony. And in the names of the officers of the Sunday school, it comes out that Dr. Olaf Nordson, my great-grandfather, was a Sunday school teacher, and several of the names there were names of people who've been prominent in the colony. So they were converted. Jansenists were converted to Methodism, and the early records of the church show it.
I would like to mention something that I found in Captain Eric Johnson's book. He listed the religion for all the people that he wrote biographies. And I just picked out one township, and that's this township here where Bishop Hill is located, Weller Township. And in the late 1870s, when he wrote that book, he listed 26 as free sint, which meant that they had no specific religious views and that they did not belong to any denomination or religious sect whatsoever. There were 20 who were Methodists, so not even here in Weller Township were there more Methodists than free sint. Precinct 26. Second Adventist 5. Jansenist 2. Then we have ren lärlig, which meant, he explained what was meant by these terms in Swedish. And he said, well, ren lärlig, that would be true to the teaching, but we don't know what teaching they were true to. Maybe they didn't want to say. There were 2 Lutherans, 2 were Ingersolite, and that means that they believed in Ingersoll's teachings. 1 was Baptist, 3 without any affiliation whatsoever, and 3 didn't have any listed, said non-listed, and Eric Johnson was one of them. So I think that if a study was made of all those people listed in Svenskan, Illinois, it would be very interesting.
When was that done?
It was done in the late 70s. It was published in 1880.
Oh.
But see, it was too early to have the Vision Covenants included in the study, so they're not included. And he says himself, he draws the conclusion that most former Jansenists did not affiliate with any church or religion.
The question, I'll be back, John. Yeah, sure.
Some sources talk about Hedstrom having led away a large number of people during Jansen's lifetime. They say 150 or some people say 100. Carolyn Anderson, in one of her writings, doubts this because very few of them turned out in Victoria. This question is directed to anybody who has an opinion on it. I'm kind of curious, this happened or not?
I think you have to include a lot more than Victoria. You have to include all as far as, it wasn't Hedstrom's game to put a place on people in Victoria. You have to put them get started wherever they get started. So you got to take in Galesburg, and Watauga, Victoria, Lake, even there was a meeting out here in Tacoma in 1858 or something. And then there's a little bit of misconception on the number of people that were stolen away from Esborn by Hedstrom, my notion. The majority of that party were not Hedstrom people from Hilley, H-I-L-L-E. My great-grandfather, his sister, and her husband, and Peter Scotland, I think were the only people from actually the Hedstrom party itself that went to Victoria. That's 4 people. I think that most of the rest of his followers actually ended up in Hanover. The other people were from Bonus or some other place, and they weren't really committed to Hedstrom. I mean, they were with him, but a lot of people said that he lost half his flock every time he got covered, and I don't think that's necessarily so.
The strength of family ties can't be underestimated here, too. The fact that a lot of the Andover Esbjorn party came from the same families as did the Bishop Hill Jansenists should be remembered, that it all related from the same parishes and provinces, and that these people maintained family relationships across religious and, I suspect, city borders quite easily.
Now can we have something about pieties in Sweden?
Well, that was not the assignment, though.
I'd like to ask you 2 questions about Jonas Hedstrom. The first question is, in my readings, I'm into genealogy, so I'm not reading the same sources as you folks are, I don't believe. But from the sources I've read, it kind of implies that without the leadership or influence of Jonas J. Hedstrom and his brother, maybe there wouldn't be a Bishop Hill or a colony out here. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. And the second thing I'd like to ask is, in the readings I hear about the first Swedish Methodist Church in the world, right?
That's
And there's a
Victoria.
stone in Victoria that
That's
says that.
Victoria.
And there's apparently another one somewhere, but I don't know where. But there's only 2, and it's in.
So let's address her first question. Do you mean to suggest, are you talking about there wouldn't have been a Bishop Hill, or this might not have been the precise location?
Right.
Which one of those
The
two?
location.
The precise location, if it had not been for the activities in the Bethelship and the Hedstrom family. Is there a consensus on that?
I'll argue that point in favor of the Jansenists having known where they were going before they ever set sail. In the newspaper Helsi in early 1845, there was a long article describing the plans of the Eric Jansenists to migrate before they ever sent Olaf Olsen over here. And they spoke very specifically of an island in the valley of the Mississippi. And that makes you wonder, and then they describe in great detail what they would find here in terms of crops, opportunity, economic growth. And that immediately makes you wonder how they could have gotten such detailed information. And it's my belief that that came in the hands of an American Presbyterian missionary, Robert Berry, who had preached in that part of Hälsingland in several trips during the early 1840s, and who had written a book called An Immigrant's and Traveler's Guide to the Valley of the Mississippi. He preached in the very villages which later became involved in the Jansenist migration. And he was also very well known to Esbjorn. So there's no doubt in my mind that much of the geographical decision-making was influenced by American missionaries. The religious decision-making was involved with the pietism that already existed in Sweden, encouraged by Methodist missionaries. And as I recall, Olsen had been a Methodist colporteur, working for Scott before he ever set sail to the United States as a colony scout. The Olsen brothers in Sweden had been Methodist colporteurs. So there are wonderful ties that link these nations and these immigrant movements long before they ever set sail. and they haven't really been adequately researched.
Do you think the Jansenists had any more than a vague idea of locating in the Mississippi Valley?
I think that they knew they were coming to the valley of the Mississippi, but I'm not sure how much more precise they were. That part has not been cleared up. They knew they were going to the valley of the Mississippi.
That's a big territory.
That's a big territory.
So what you're suggesting is then that the influence of the Hedstrom brothers may have been to make site-specific.
Site-specific after Olson had gotten to New York.
And then the other question she raised, how many can lay claim to being the first Swedish Methodist church? One does in Victoria. You're suggesting that perhaps there's another one or two that lays claim to that as well.
Victoria was the first.
Some might claim the Bethel ship in New York Harbor was the first.
Well, that was never organized as a Swedish Methodist church. It was a ship that had been converted to hold services in. But as far as I've been able to study and read, it had not been organized as a Methodist church congregation. Its clientele was transient.
Maybe you're referring to the Andover Methodist Church. Huh?
No, no.
There is a sign out there by a private home in Andover, and I can't remember what it says. Do you remember, Joe? Anderson's, what does it say there?
Parsonage.
The first parsonage?
Parsonage.
In the walls? Swedish First Methodist parsonage. Okay. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Of course, the Methodists had made such strong incursions in Stockholm because of the effort of George Scott, who had ostensibly come to help the English people in Sweden, that the Swedish Lutherans finally invited him to leave the country. And this was before any of this migration took place. The Methodist roots were firmly planted in Swedish soil long before the Eric Jansenists or any of the others started migrating.
Well, Rachel Gibbs, who was here this evening, wrote a paper for me once on the first Methodist church in the world at Victoria, and you have been exonerated tonight. No one has successfully challenged the conclusion you reached then. Any other comments? Well, if not, I thank my fellow participants. Thank you for coming. And whereas maybe the leaders of these groups that came here were inclined toward perfectionism, some far more than inclined, extreme advocates of perfectionism, perhaps the Lutherans backed off rather quickly from that idea. But perhaps to the people to whom they were speaking, the issue was not perfectionism or lack of perfectionism, but the issue when, if they were a follower of a strong leader and that strong leader was no longer present, the rapidity with which someone else came to try and be their leader. And the choice of whether they wanted to continue a religion or if they wished to have only a religion in their heart that was not known to anyone outside of it. Yolanda, do you have any concluding remarks?
Thank you all very much.
Thank you and good night. Yes, Rachel.
mention the Mormons?
Yeah, Joe Smith and the Mormons.
I have a great-grandfather that deserted the Mormons.